Welcome back, everyone, to Cyber Voices, the official podcast of the Australian Information Security Association, but you probably know us as ASA. I'm your host, David Savawillett, and it is my pleasure to bring you the diverse voices of the Australian and international cyber community. Today, I'm joined from the United States by Michael Kosak, Director of Threat Intelligence at LastPass. Mike brings nearly 25 years of threat intelligence experience to the conversation, with a career that began in the US Department of Defense as a counterterrorism intelligence officer. During that time, he led the Pentagon office responsible for intelligence updates to the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, served 3 deployments to Iraq supporting Operation Iraqi Freedom, and acted as a senior command representative to Joint Special Operations Command for the Defense Intelligence Agency. Since moving into the private sector, Mike has led strategic cyber intelligence and threat evaluation at Bank of America, headed the cyber threat intelligence team at TIAA, and now drives threat intelligence at LastPass, giving him a unique vantage point over both the geopolitical and criminal sides of the threat landscape. Today, we're going to unpack the current state of that landscape with what's going on with the ongoing conflict in the Middle East, what that means for defenders globally, how phishing and phishing kits are evolving, and where AI is genuinely changing the game versus where it's just adding noise. Mike, welcome to Cyber Voices.
Thank you very much, David. I'm excited to be here.
I'm assuming I can call you Mike.
Please do. Yeah, absolutely. I think my mom's around if somebody calls me Michael. So,
listeners who are hearing you or meeting you for the first time, Mike, can you tell us a bit about your journey from counterterrorism intelligence in the DoD through to leading threat intelligence at an organization like LastPass, and what that transition has taught you about the cyber threat space?
Yeah, sure. So I made the transition about 10 years ago, or I should say successfully made the transition about 10 years ago. It took me about 2 years to make the jump. So as you mentioned, I started in counterterrorism. It was a very mission-focused job. That's what really drove me. It was important. I felt like I was protecting people. It was something that I learned very early in my career was important to me. It motivated me. It made it easy to get out of bed in the morning. When the time came that I figured it was I wanted to try something new. Things were changing within the execution of the war on terror is kind of winding down. And I was starting to think about what's next and where can I take the skills that I've learned, specifically in threat intelligence, and apply them into, a new and upcoming field. And this would have been around 2013 when I started to look at this shift. So I signed up for some basic courses at my local community college, took the Security Plus prep course and a couple other very basic courses. I mean, I was coming from a very physical security oriented, tracking patterns of life and assessing when attacks could occur and that sort of thing with straight terrorism and physical terrorism, force protection. So I had to figure out how to port that skill set over into cybersecurity. So I established those basic skills. There's been a really interesting sort of exodus of people from the counterterrorism community into cybersecurity. I think because a lot of us are so mission driven, that was part of what brought me into cybersecurity as well. You're back to protecting people and protecting what's important to them. So that's what got me into cybersecurity. Like I said, it took me a couple of years to kind of finally get my foot in the door. It was a friend of mine that I had worked with at the Pentagon who had successfully made the jump, and then he brought me along, and the rest is kind of history at this point. But it taught me, as far as making the shift and what that prepared me for, the counterterrorism experience prepared me for as I moved into cybersecurity was the global nature of it. The idea that, and this was really big within the special operations community, and General McChrystal used to talk about this, former commander of Joint Special Operations Command. He had a saying, he would always say, it takes a network to defeat a network. And that was in combating terrorism. That's very much the same in cybersecurity. That when we look at the sort of malicious actors we're dealing with now, you look at the COM, you look at, shiny hunters, all these other groups. These are loose affiliations of people that are working together to share knowledge and tactics and everything else. And if we're not taking that same approach on the good guy side, then we're acting at a deficit. So it really made the switch much easier.
And you're not the first person I've spoken to, even in the last couple of weeks, or either spoken to or heard speaking at events, who has made that jump from the intelligence community to the private sector. Slightly different example, but our the National Cybersecurity Coordinator in Australia, Lieutenant General Michelle McGuinness, I heard her speak at a keynote recently, and she talks about how she is a recovering intelligence officer. And there seems to be a lot of that happening. And the private sector seems to be really valuing that federal level intelligence skill set. Why do you think that is? Not why are people leaving, but why do you think the private sector values that skill set so much?
Sure. Yeah, I think there's probably two aspects to it. And one specifically within cybersecurity is that people coming out of the government usually have that sort of cutting edge experience of using nation state level tool sets and techniques and that sort of thing. So that's one aspect of it. The other thing I think from the intelligence tradecraft side of it is that federal governments really were the ones who applied that analytic tradecraft, came up with the processes that work, established the processes around priority intelligence requirements and how to execute a threat intelligence program. They really did the legwork on that. And so if you pick up people who come out of the federal government or national government, that kind of gives you a leg up and a shortcut into a much more mature cyber threat intelligence program coming right out of the gate. And I deeply appreciate General McGuinness because she spent some time at my alma mater, the Defense Intelligence Agency. She was there as a deputy director for a while. So I'm always happy. I got to see her speak at CyberCon last year, actually, and thought she was fantastic.
She's fantastic, and I always value the opportunity to get to hear from her. I think as well, I often characterize this as a CISO as, we were corporate people who wanted to get into tech and IT. I know 20 years ago when I first got into it, cyber was not really a thing. And, the role evolved into what it is today. And at some point along the line, we became these real frontline defenders where there is almost like a counterterrorism kind of element to our roles, which we were never really trained or prepared for. So I think that from my perspective, the value we get from people like yourself and Lieutenant General Michelle McGuinness coming into our community and being able to help us focus more and also just take some of that mental load and burden off to help us do our jobs better is incredibly valued and probably a good opportunity for those who've spent many years in what I'm sure is a very intense field, move into something where they can kind of like have a much broader impact. I want to pivot though into what is the current global cyber threat environment in 2026. How would you characterize that threat environment? And what's your message today to Australian defenders in terms of what they should be paying the closest attention to right now?
Sure. No, that's I hate to put it like this, but it's not great and it's getting worse, I think is probably the best way to start it out. I mean, all the things that have defined the cyber threat environment over the last couple of years are certainly still there. Ransomware, the continuing increase in info stealers, the use of living off the land, legitimate credentials, the typical cyber espionage, all that remains against the larger backdrop of the cyber threat environment. But now you lay over that, we've got the war in Iran and the sort of, the heightened cyber threat environment that brings and the increased activity and the increased uncertainty. You combine that with AI and how that's changing things. And I know we'll talk about that more later, but there's certainly a lot to cover there. And then really, I think, I know a lot of people, there's been a lot of ink spilled about Mythos and Project Glasswing and what that means. And, what is the actual moat between frontier AI deployment with this sort of technology and open source or malicious actor use of those same things, and how that moat is shrinking. I think we're on the precipice of some really painful times when it comes to vulnerability detection, exploitation, all that sort of thing. So, like I said, it's not great and getting worse. That's what concerns me right now. It's not so much even the global cyber threat environment in general is in many ways, like I said, very similar. It's that what's going to happen when the core capabilities of Mythos or something similar break out and sort of escape containment. And then what does that mean for the larger cyber threat environment? That's what I'm concerned about primarily in 2026. And I would say specifically, I think it's globally true, but I think, that's certainly Australian defenders need to worry about that just like everybody else. in addition to the, I think specifically for Australia and the Pacific region generally, China and what's happening with China and the relationship between the US and China and the potential implications there when it comes to Taiwan, certainly as a potential flashpoint for the last 5 years, people have been looking at 2027 or sort of speculating about 2027 as a potential year for China to make a move on Taiwan. The implications for that in the cyber threat environment are certainly massive. And Australia will be right at the forefront of that. They already are frequently, critical infrastructure, education, defense industrial base, all of those are frequently targeted by China as it is. But when we drop that as a flashpoint in, that's another thing to keep an eye on within the region.
Mike, you've given me a fair few avenues in which I could go down in terms of questions. I mean, whether it be mythos, and I even as I think of that, I think of, my own vulnerability program and how I get, the bosses above me, the executives and the boards to kind of sit up and pay attention to that as well, which I know a lot of us are dealing with. I think one of the biggest things that everyone's kind of got eyes on at the moment is the ongoing and escalating conflict in the Middle East. And the conflict you mentioned with Iran is just the latest, but certainly probably one of the most impactful on all of us across a number of different areas. And those implications, what does it mean for organizations sitting half a world away in Australia? I mean, we've got prices at the petrol pump and all that kind of stuff. There's the big things that everyday Australians, but in terms of cyber, people working in cyber and defenders, what are those implications that we should be thinking about?
That's a great question. And I mean, at the core of it, the issue, and this is the issue with all of cyber, is that physical proximity just doesn't matter, as we know. So any sort of kicking of the hornet's nest in the Middle East immediately has global implications for the cyber threat environment. And Australia, as a member of Five Eyes, is seen as a fair target by Iran and Iranian aligned threat actors. I think we've seen that certainly in the past. We see it with continued cyber espionage as well, but also the sort of patriotic hacktivist activity that we've seen associated with Iran. I mean, since at least 2011, 2012 with Operation Ababil and the attacks on the banks and specifically in the US. But that global implication radiates out of the region irrespective of where a country lies. That's the main issue with cyber, is that the threat is irrespective of physical location. So Australia's proximity to the Middle East doesn't necessarily provide protection. And Iran has demonstrated time and again that they will target any sort of country or organization that they see aligned with the United States or Israel. But particularly, when it comes to Five Eyes, it's with the United States. We've seen cyber espionage attacks, patriotic hacktivism. And one of the things I think with Iran that's particularly that I think increases the threat to Australia is that Iran and its aligned actors will very much target based on opportunity and retrofit the rationale into the attack. So, and a great example of that is Stryker, the attack that happened in the US, but I'll just use that as an example because I think it's illustrative of that point. I don't necessarily think Iran was targeting Stryker as an organization they really wanted to take down. I think they found the opportunity. There were credentials online and everything else, and obviously once you get your foot in the door and into Intune, it's game on. So excellent opportunity for them. And then when their rationale comes out as, well, Stryker purchased an Israel-based company in 2019, I'm pretty sure Handala Group that's not what fed into their targeting to drive it. I think they'll grab whatever's there and find a way to get attention. And then, like I said, square peg, round hole, that rationale in to make it look like this is part of some larger campaign. So, I say that just to kind of keep the awareness within Australia around the fact that those geographic borders don't mean that much to them. It's simply the alignment with the United States as part of Five Eyes is enough to justify any sort of operation they could conduct.
Yeah, and you mentioned some really interesting use cases there for who they could be targeting. And, and I'm no expert when it comes to counterterrorism and geopolitics, apart from what I see on the news. But I think there are the obvious industries in Australia, critical infrastructure, government defense. We've got AUKUS, all that kind of stuff going on, which would seem like the obvious targets. But a lot of us CISOs and defenders alike are all getting asked the questions by our bosses and our boards, what are the implications of this for us and what else should we be doing? What's the threat to us? What other industries do you think should be paying, especially in Australia, should be paying close attention right now and shoring up their defenses as a result of what's happening in the Middle East?
Yeah. Well, like we mentioned, defense industrial base, of course, government, any sort of manufacturing, because one of the things there was just a great report that came out in the last week or two about Iran conducting basically false flag operations and hiding them as ransomware. So, I think that opens the aperture to just about any potential industry that needs to be concerned. Iranian targeting is they will grab the low-hanging fruit irrespective of industry or anything else. And I think that's important for organizations to remember as well. One of the things that we tend to see in the United States a lot, but really around the globe, when Iran conducts these sort of cyber operations, is they'll even just do simple website defacements. For some small city in the United States, if they can get their foot in the door and it gives them an opportunity to get some attention, embarrass the cybersecurity infrastructure of the United States because they've seized the website of some municipality and posted some pro-Iranian message. I don't think any organization or country that is, part of Five Eyes right now is necessarily immune to that. I think the United States certainly bears the brunt of that, and for obvious reasons. But I do think there is that target of opportunity that tends to be attractive to Iran, where they just want to project power as best they can in any way that they can.
And that's what it comes down to, right? It's a projection of power and to show that, hey, even to the American people or even in the Australian people in the cases that we're talking about. I almost thought like, oh, is this just all about sowing chaos? But I think that final point kind of makes more sense. It's like, no, we want to demonstrate that just because this is all happening a world away, we can still get you where you live.
Yeah, it's really about getting people to think twice before openly aligning, with Five Eyes, especially right now. Any wedge that can be driven, irrespective of how small it is useful to them.
Yeah, and I think I mentioned that I only know what I see on the news, right? But this isn't the conflicts of the 90s and the early 2000s anymore, where you can just sit and shake your head at how awful it is and be grateful that it's happening a world away. Because, like you said, physical proximity just doesn't matter anymore. I want to move on to the entry points of so many incidents, which you've talked about phishing remaining being just a constant, right? And we talk about that a lot on this show, and it just comes up again and again and again, and for good reason. What are you seeing right now in terms of how phishing kits and the broader phishing as a service ecosystem is evolving? And we'll touch as well. I wouldn't mind hearing your thoughts on where AI is genuinely, changing the game in this space as well.
Yeah, and I definitely have some thoughts on that. But as far as phishing, that's exactly it. It still works. And there's, and I won't get into the point now much, but, and I think it's beating a dead horse at this point anyway, but talking about how phishing has advanced because of AI, just insofar as crafting of the emails, the sort of guidance that people have gotten over the last 20 years of look for misspellings, poor grammar, that sort of thing. All that's out the window, and that's been the case since ChatGPT 3, so for the last 3 or 4 years, like this has kind of faded into the background. But so there's that aspect of it. But phishing kits in general, they continue to work. They continue to be lucrative. So they just continue to spread. We certainly see plenty of phishing activity targeting our customers. We spend, in my role as the director of threat intelligence, that's probably 80% of my day is dealing with phishing, relaying what we're seeing to customers, picking apart phishing kits, trying to figure out where things are going next. We do see more interesting changes now as AI is starting to change the sort of phishing ecosystem in more interesting ways. It's not just targeting is easier and the emails look better. There's two different aspects that I think that we're really seeing now that are impacting it in a very real and like I said, more interesting way. One is, of course, the scope and scale of these, where you have now people can just kind of fire and forget with this stuff. They set it up. It doesn't even have to look good. It is really a shots on goal approach with a lot of these phishing emails now. So almost counterintuitive to what we were just talking about with how phishing emails can look better. There's also a lot of really terrible looking phishing emails out there that relatively, and I think that's a reflection of relatively unsophisticated threat actors stepping into this environment now, which is the other aspect of how AI is changing this, is the barrier to entry has been lowered. So, these guys are just kind of winging it out there and they don't care. You can knock down their infrastructure. They're just going to set it up really quickly. They can automate a lot of these processes. And so, that's those two elements have combined where they can operate a lot more quickly and, with a lot less work. And they don't have to be that good at it anymore. They don't even need to buy a phishing kit or, phishing as a service. We've been tracking a campaign now for some time where, our best, pretty high confidence in the assessment that we're watching these threat actors slowly develop their own personal phishing kit. And you can tell it's developed by AI because there'll be a lot of the sort of technical hallmarks in the code itself, just as far as, relatively, it's clean code, but really verbose notes in the code. And then just like connected by absolutely hand-fisted code where it's obvious somebody who doesn't really know what they're doing is just like going through an HTML handbook and trying to, figure something out to connect it or, for whatever reason. So there's that aspect to it that I think is really and I won't even get into the more advanced sorts, when we think about the developments in deep fakes with voice cloning and all the rest of that stuff, even just basic phishing. More people can do it. They can do it faster. Their level of effort to do it is lower. So like I said, if you're knocking down infrastructure, they don't even care because it's just like, well, it only took me 10 seconds to set this up anyway. I could do this all day. Captain America and the Avengers, they just keep going after it. And so like, to me, that's what concerns me more about phishing right now is that it's so easy for people and these sorts of tools are empowering the kind of typical script kiddies to just punch above their weight.
Yeah, and I think it means as well, from what I've seen, just in terms of phishing that is targeting like my own organization and staff, is when you're doing the simulations these days, it's hard to just fall back on the typical like Outlook or Microsoft Office or SharePoint kind of provide your credentials, because it's almost like there is no typical kind of scam anymore. Like, I have seen so much stuff changing and evolving where I'm like, wow, they really tried that? What's something, and this is maybe a bit of a question without notice, like what's been one of the more insane or verbose phishing campaigns that you've seen of late, which may have been AI driven or not?
Yeah, it's probably this one we're dealing with now, just because it has been, it's like watching threat actors grow up. So we've watched at least 3 versions of this phishing kit, and it's gone from just kind of the typical phishing login page to, now by version 3, it's like an attacker in the middle reverse proxy. And I know they didn't figure that out on their own in a couple of weeks. Like, this is, but again, it's like, it just comes back to that, just using these shortcuts, and they're figuring this stuff out much more quickly. And, what concerns me is that there's nothing stopping other people from picking this up and doing the exact same thing. And I know in talking to peers at other organizations, this is being seen elsewhere too, the kind of this fight against phishing sites and takedowns and stuff like that. That's speeding up, and that operational tempo is just moving faster and faster and getting harder and harder to stay ahead of. More takedowns more quickly. And, which I think, again, is just a reflection of the impact on speed and scale with AI across the cyber threat environment in general.
Yeah. Something that made me, we're having a very serious conversation, but something that made me giggle then was hearing about how it's obvious some of the code that you're seeing in terms of like AI developed malware or phishing kits is so obvious because of that verboseness of AI. Because I think we've all probably had that situation recently where we've rolled our eyes a little bit at a colleague's email or document or the way something's been structured, because you're like, really? Could you have just tried a little bit harder to go over the AI generated content, get rid of the M dashes and all the bolding of all the keywords? That'd be great. But It's good to see that reassuring to see
less
that
emojis would be nice.
Yeah, it's making it just as obvious to spot what the bad guys are doing as well. And to wrap us up, if you can, Mike, if you could leave the Australian cyber community with one piece of practical guidance to cut through the noise of just this threat environment and, the dark days that we say are coming, what would that be?
Yeah, I'm going to cheat a little bit because I think there's actually two things, but one is sort of, the Essential 8 still covers most of it. I mean, that's great. Follow the Essential 8. That's step one. And all the things that are part of that, credential management, patching, everything involved in the Essential 8. If you got that, you're 80% of the way there. When we look at what's coming with Mythos and those sorts of capabilities, I think having a good understanding of your tech stack and your shadow AI, shadow tech and everything else is going to be really critical because, when that flash to bang from vulnerability detection to exploitation really starts to speed up and balloon out as more vulnerabilities are detected, being able to respond as quickly as possible is going to be critical. And that's knowing tech infrastructure is obviously it's a huge problem, especially in large organizations, but even in small organizations, you don't necessarily know what's out there. So getting a good understanding now and figuring out how to get that understanding now, I think will really pay a lot of dividends in this upcoming threat environment.
100%, and reassuring to hear that the even internationally, the Essential 8 as a baseline level of technical control to have in place still resonates quite strongly. And it's an evolving framework too, which I've been following quite closely lately myself. Well, there you have it, everyone. So that was Mike from LastPass, who, whilst there is certainly some painful times ahead, I think one of the things we can take away from this is that our jobs are still more important, if not more important than they ever have been. And they are certainly not going to get boring anytime soon. So, Mike, thank you so much for tuning in the evening or beaming into the virtual studio in your evening to join me today. And thank you so much for sharing your voice with us.
Absolutely. Thank you again, David.
Thank you for listening to another episode of Cyber Voices. Our music is by Sanar Garut, our show artwork is by Studio Quarantine, and we record our show at This Is a Studio in Pran, Melbourne, part of Popplant Productions. Please make sure you follow the show on your podcast platform of choice and leave us a 5-star review. This will help others find the show. Also, please follow the association on LinkedIn and Instagram. If you want to add your voice to our ever-growing chorus of diverse cyber voices, have questions, feedback, or would like to be a sponsor, you can do so by emailing us at cybervoices@aisa.org.au. That's cybervoices@aisa.org.au. Are you an AISA member? If not, you should consider joining our network of over 12,000 members across Australia. An AISA membership can open doors, build professional networks, create lifetime friendships, and offer exclusive training, events, and other perks. Become a member today by heading to our website at aisa.org.au. That is all for today. I hope you will join us again next time on Cyber Voices.